Labour's plan for workers' rights, stopping the boats, and is going green a vote winner. This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Craig McKinley, Labour frontbencher Jess Phillips, The Mirror's political editor John Stevens and former Conservative advisor Anita Boateng. Today, Labour's Angela Rayner sets out her plan for workers' rights. But will it be enough to impress union bosses?
Labour will start by bringing forward an employment rights bill to legislate for this within the first 100 days of entering office. That's a cast-iron commitment.
The message is clear. Vote blue, go green.
That was nearly 20 years ago, but will going green be a vote winner at the next election? More than 20,000 migrants have crossed the Channel this year. Does any party have a plan that would stop the boats? And the Chancellor says he'll struggle to afford any tax cuts this autumn. Let's start with that final story you just heard there in the headlines about tax cuts and Jeremy Hunt. Here is the Times headline. Jeremy Hunt says tax cuts are unlikely at the autumn statement. In an interview, he said because of low growth and an ageing population, he'd struggle to make them. Is he right, Craig?
I think there is a reality there, particularly about ageing population, but we've got the highest taxes for 70 years. I've been very vocally opposed to previous budgets, not least the rise in corporation tax. When you look at the dynamism of the Republic of Ireland's economy, they're actually receiving in corporation tax receipts 4 times per head than we do in the UK because they're attracting international business and international capital. I certainly hope he can find some room for some tax cuts so we can show, yep, we've been through a tough time, we've had an unbelievably expensive COVID period, but this is what conservatism is all about. Now, the trouble is, the OBR have now been this exalted institution that everything they say has to be taken as holy writ. I did notice the other day...
Who set it up?
Well, let me just give you some facts. The other day, their report in March about where public finance borrowing would be by last month was 11 billion wrong over just 3.5 months.
But you're saying they're affordable. You're saying tax cuts are affordable in the current economic backdrop. Well, I think there is a lot more tax receipts coming through than were anticipated. Jess?
We've got the stealth taxes in terms of the freezing of allowances. We've got a lot more CGT coming in because a lot of landlords are selling.
All right. Well, let's not go through the whole. Let's not go through the whole of the tax structure of the UK.
The income is higher than expected.
I only want an answer to a simple question, which is: are tax cuts affordable in the autumn statement, Jess?
Well, I mean, I find it, it's not really news. Jeremy Hunt was always going to end up this way, and the Tories have sort of dilly-dallied around the idea that they might have tax cuts because people in their pie, that at the moment they're constantly just fighting with themselves, and people like Craig, who has a perfectly legitimate and conservative view about tax cuts, have been pushing the Chancellor on it. But I think blaming an ageing population and the sort of COVID and all this, the Tories have been in power for 13 years of stagnant growth, which is why we are struggling to bring in tax receipts enough to fund public services properly and/or give out money if that was, as it is, Craig's desire. And the idea that we didn't know there was going to be an ageing population at this next budget.
No, but the ONS had to revise their report just last week, saying actually our growth was one of the best in the G7.
Well, all right, but of course you can be selective about the statistics that you use. If we take the whole period generally,
I mean, that's what he's saying. He's blaming old people this time.
It's a reality of life that is going to cost a lot of money. That's just a reality.
A surprise that Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, is pretty well ruling out tax cuts at the autumn statement or not?
No, I don't think so. And I think that if you look at any of the polling that's been done recently, the Tories have wrecked their reputation on tax. And you look at why that's happened. That's happened because of Rishi Sunak, because as Chancellor, he kept putting taxes up and up and up. And he kept giving interviews saying, oh, yes, I'm a low tax Chancellor. I'm really keen to cut taxes while putting them up. And you look at the promises the Tory party made at the last election, which you stood on, Craig, when you promised, and Rishi Sunak promised as MP, not to put up income tax, not to put up VAT, and not to put up national insurance. And what did they do? They put up national insurance.
But are Labour going to put in their manifesto, we will cut taxes if we win the election?
Well, I think that clearly you listen to what Keir Starmer has been saying and what Rachel Reeves has been saying, and they've been clear that for working people, they are not going to put people's taxes up. So a couple of weeks ago, I did an interview with Keir Starmer and asked him, are you going to put up the basic rate of income tax? And he said no.
And cutting them?
Well, I think that we'll have to wait for the manifesto to see what happens to that. I think that's probably less likely.
Scepticism there in response, Anita, from you. Politically, though, for Jeremy Hunt, I suppose he could have another fiscal event, if we call it that, in the jargon, before the next general election, and he might cut taxes then.
Well, there will be a budget, presumably, in March, April, and we'll see what happens then. But the thing that we haven't talked about around this table is inflation. That's the actual reason why Jeremy Hunt is in the situation he's in. Tax cuts at this stage will probably be inflationary. And the government's #1 target is to halve inflation. We were at 10.1% in January. We're now at 6.8% as of July. It is on track. And if the government can do that, everyone will feel richer. I completely agree with Craig that ultimately tax cutting is what Conservatives are about, and I think that's absolutely what the government wants to and should do. And also that tax receipts are high at the moment, extraordinarily high. But the reality is the room for manoeuvre is very much constrained by inflation.
And Jeremy Hunt said exactly that in the other
part. And that is the big elephant in the room. And just on this point, I can't resist, on Keir Starmer and where he would sit on tax cuts. I mean, if Labour wins the next election and does not raise taxes, I will be astonished, because the amount of things they have to say...
You'll be astonished?
The amount they have to say about the way they're going to fix all these elements of public services which fundamentally require more money, and the constant narrative around growth is going to be the thing, the panacea that completely resolves all of these fundamental, knotty and tricky problems in the economy.
You are deluded, Lisa, if you think that just a couple of months before an election in a budget early next year, they could suddenly take a penny off income tax and people think, oh yes, the Tory party is the party of low tax. They're not going to do that because they're not stupid and they can remember the last 4 years.
Well, I think it's absolutely right for the government at some point in the future to find an opportunity to decrease tax, because that's what being Conservatives all about.
I'm not saying what happened a year ago.
70-year high.
A year ago,
I don't
understand. Who is Conservative Party crashed our economy?
Conservatives or Labour? That's
well, look at the promises made at the last election. They weren't kept, cannot be trusted.
My question is simply, who is going to be lowering tax, Labour or Conservative?
Well, let's ask that question. Let's ask that
That's my question.
I mean, Anita says she'll be astonished if Labour doesn't put up taxes.
The question being of who is going to be lower in tax, what I tell you is what the Labour Party says before the election is, and what it stands on its manifesto, it will stick to, unlike the Tories, we have the highest tax burden of 70 years under the Tories. So they like to go and say, I really hate taxes, whilst whacking up everybody's taxes all over the country. I mean, read it and weep. The country has lost faith in them to manage anything fiscally. I mean, like I say, we are a year on from the calamity of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, which cost everybody in our country dearly for many reasons. And it was all because they wanted to be all like, we're the best Conservatives, have some cash.
Let's just, finally, for the record, will Labour cut taxes if they win the next election?
The Labour Party will present all of its tax plans. OK, so you're going to cut taxes now, the Tories?
I would like us to cut taxes, because that is a growth agenda.
The Labour Party will present but the Labour Party has already presented how it will tax more fairly, and it will make sure that people like, for example, as she was, Rishi Sunak's wife was a non-dom, that those people are paying fair taxes in the country where they live.
All right, let's talk a little bit more, actually, about the Labour Party, because it's been a big day so far for Angela Rayner, Labour's deputy leader. She was recently promoted to the new Shadow Levelling Up Secretary last week. She's delivered a speech at the Trades Union Congress in Liverpool talking about strengthening workers' rights and real-life levelling up, including committing the party categorically to repealing the government's anti-strike legislation. Let's have a listen.
They gave us the minimum service levels bill, a spiteful and bitter attack that threatens nurses with the sack. And we know that going on strike is always the last resort, but it's a fundamental freedom that must be respected. So let me tell you loud and clear, Congress, the next Labour government will ask Parliament to repeal these anti-trade union laws within the first 100 days.
How radical is this New Deal plan that Angela Rayner talks about in terms of workers' rights?
Well, you look at what's in there, it is quite comprehensive. There is stuff like banning 0 hours contracts. That's something that was in this New Deal for workers. There had been a slight question mark over that in recent months. A ban on blacklisting was also, there was a question mark, will they actually do that or not? And obviously there you heard Angela Rayner speaking, being very clear in the first 100 days of a Labour government, you would see this employment rights bill passed by Parliament.
Right. What do you say to that, Craig?
Well, I would say she's playing to the audience that is the main funder of the Labour Party, so I'm not surprised that she's saying these sort of things.
Who's the main funder of the Tory Party?
Peculiarly, strikes have been seen mainly in public sector. They're not seen widely in the private sector. So this is playing to an audience that tends to vote Labour, that opens their wallet for a Labour government. I think we had a pretty good settled position on union rights and all of the rest of it. And it's peculiar, isn't it? What we're proposing with the minimum guarantee is actually what a very left-of-centre country like France and its railway demands of its own workers on a hugely unionised railway system. Well, it's not unusual.
All right, we'll come on to the minimum services legislation specifically in a moment. But Jess, I suppose broadly, strengthening workers' rights with some of the examples that we heard there from John, will it lead to growth in the economy?
I mean, the whole point of it is to encourage wage growth, for example. Certainly hasn't.
Wage growth now.
Certainly has been stagnant. The lack of collective bargaining, the lack of the ability for people to feel but essentially secure in their work has been a rot on our economy for the past 10 years. People are genuinely in much more insecure labour than they were 20 years ago, 10 years ago even. And what have we seen? We've seen stagnating growth. So the Labour Party always has an eye on what is going to be good for growth, but not at any cost. And actually, this is one where you get both.
I'm slightly curious about this because the idea of this workers' legislation, from my perspective, was very much for the Labour Party to do something very radical that basically didn't cost any money. And if we look at the proposals from where they initially were about this kind of single definition of worker, so basically you can be self-employed or you can be a full-time paid-up employee. You have all the rights from day one. All of that has been watered down quite significantly. So I am surprised that, I mean, I'm sure Angela is great and does a rousing speech, that actually there aren't more questions being asked about this commitment that Starmer has to some of these ideas which are on the more radical end.
Well, has it?
And we might start to see some of that dislocation.
Has it been watered down then?
Well, the reality is that questions will absolutely be asked, and that is what they have said, that they're going to set up a special commission with employers and the trade unions and the Labour Party to get to a sensible position that everybody can agree on, which if only the Tories had done any talking to any workers or any of the employers recently, maybe we wouldn't be in the mess.
I've just got a very different philosophical view on these things, that we have 1.2 million jobs available in the UK.
Unemployment going up.
If you have a buoyant economy, that is the main driver for workers' rights, better pay, better conditions, because employers have to offer more to attract the best and people that they want to work for them. That, to me, is a philosophical divide that I have. And a lot of these measures will only really apply to the public sector.
How's it going? How's that going for you? How's your theory going for you currently with rising unemployment, with actually the doubling, for example, of work visas from outside because we can't get workers, with a massive increasing labour force currently sick and out of work and not returning from COVID? How's that cracking on for you?
Well, we've got 5.4 million people on a form of working age benefit. We've got 1.2 million jobs available. If we filled those 1.2 million jobs, I'm sure the growth of the economy would create another few 100,000 jobs. And yet, sadly, I'm not happy about it. We are just resorting to immigration to fill those jobs.
13 years in, crack on.
To me, well, COVID stopped a lot of the sanctioning that was happening at DWP. You know that. And I'm afraid it's been a little bit too slow to take their foot off the pedal. If there's a job available, in my view, old-fashioned view, it should be filled. And if you don't want to take it, I'm afraid you should face some sort of
sanctioning made the welfare bill go up. The housing benefit bill has gone up. So it wasn't working. You've had 13 years. It isn't working. We've got masses of vacancies and huge either underskilled or out of work, that it's not working. Your plan for workers isn't working. What a surprise.
So you're telling me you're going to be more dynamic at getting those 5.4 million people into work than the Conservatives are?
Yes.
I really don't believe that.
Well, we'll see, won't we?
Right, well, let's talk then about one of the ideas, which is repealing this Minimum Services Levels Act or legislation, which would give the Secretary of State powers to introduce regulations specifying minimum service levels in respect of a list of public services. Is Labour right to repeal that law, Craig?
Well, no, I don't think it's right at all, because what we're doing is actually copying what is the norm across many countries, many of which across Europe are left of centre.
But that's not a reason for doing it. Why is it a good idea?
Well, because I think the public, just think of the upset that's caused when rail goes on strike. And let's not forget, a lot of these workers are fairly well paid, better paid than many of the average pay across this country. You then have London, the big cities are completely devoid of people on those strike days, because also thanks to, Sadiq Khan in London, you can't even afford to drive into London.
Well, we'll come on to that in a minute.
Let alone the traffic that you'll face.
Well, hang on.
So sorry, the workers across Kent and Surrey and in those home counties, they've got a right to go to work, to earn a pay, to feed their families, to then not have to find childcare provision and all of that aggravation. This is about working together as a community to make this country work.
Jess,
so it worries me that they want to go backwards on that. So
is there a risk there'll be more strikes? Is there a risk there'll be more strikes under a Labour government that repeals the minimum services legislation?
It's funny because all these strikes have actually happened. There wasn't a single day of nurses' strike, for example, under the last Labour government. So we've got lots of strikes under Tory Britain. And Craig incites France as the example of having this legislation. A country famous for the amount of strike days that it takes. Since they put this legislation into France, it has increased the number of strikes.
Well, let's have a look at this. Well, let's have a look. Well, hang on.
His view is to just increase salaries to whatever is being asked for by the unions.
Who
You can get rid of
that?
strikes, but it won't do much for the public purse.
Who has said that?
All right, I'm going to just leave you two for a moment and come over here. Let me just show you this headline, John. The Daily Telegraph. Teaching union threatens to shut down any school that sacks teachers under anti-strike laws. Daniel Kabedi, he is the General Secretary of the National Education Union, threatening to shut down any school that sacks teachers. Isn't it going a little bit far?
Well, I think that this legislation wasn't brought in to reduce the number of strike days. It was brought in to inflame tensions. Yeah. And instead of getting around the table, getting the unions, getting the employers, coming to a sensible deal to sort this out, this legislation was brought in as part of a war between the Tory party and thinking, oh, we can stoke some row with the unions and the Labour Party and this will benefit us politically. And it's not worked out like that at all.
Anita?
Well, yeah, I just disagree. I think John is very reasonable on a lot of things, but I think this is deeply, deeply cynical. But the reality of the situation is, at the moment, when it comes to strikes, there aren't enough considerations about how much flexibility you can provide around support that allows you to be able to strike in a way that doesn't affect the people that are most deeply going to feel this, whether that's trains or nurses or anything. And the situation that we have in Italy, for instance, is a situation where there's just a lot more conversation about what the requirements might be, what minimum standards might look like, so that striking can happen in a way that is safe. And that, I think, is important, not just for the public services, but also for the people that use it, and a degree of certainty about what
should have done that, shouldn't they?
And I think that the minimum services bill is a power that was granted that allows government to go in there and have those conversations with union bosses in a way that I actually think will be quite constructive. But this idea that
the Conservative government are going to be constructive with either unions, workers, public sector workers or otherwise is absolutely for the birds. They have not, if only they sat down and talked to them.
They have sorted out some of the strikes, of course.
But after months, Anita mentioned nurses there. The nurses' strike, there was a problem. They said that we're not being paid enough. We think the deal should be higher. For months on end, the government refused to get around the table, and we had strikes that went on and on and on and on. And then eventually they had to get around the table and sort things out. And now we're going through it all over again with the doctors. Why won't they just get round the table and sort things out sensibly?
You only have to see Mike Lynch. I mean, Mike Lynch, I don't believe
it's Mick Lynch.
Mick Lynch. I don't suppose he's in this for his workers at all. He is very avowedly following an anti-conservative pathway. It's as simple as that.
And
I can't understand why you can't see that. You probably support it, obviously, but please have a reality
I
check.
definitely support an anti-conservative point of view. That's literally my life's work.
At the expense of workers trying to get into London to work. Is that right?
On behalf of workers.
Okay.
All right.
You shouldn't pit workers against one another, because collective bargaining for all the workers, including the ones in Surrey and Kent, will pay dividends for them all.
Let's just talk about something else that's been suggested. It is just a proposal, and this is the right to switch off, where workers can disconnect, not reply to emails and messages when they are not officially working, so outside of business hours. Good idea?
I think it's a reasonable idea, actually. In this connected world, we are on the go 24/7, and many employees are certainly that as well. We're on holiday and all the rest of it. Very difficult to enforce. I think many workers do it because they actually care about the institution they're working for and want to see it thrive and do well. So they accept that as sort of the new norm. Whether that's a good new norm, probably not. I've often said that social media, etc., is probably one of the worst inventions of the modern age.
But that's a different discussion. I mean, do you agree with Craig?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these days people, like, even when you're on holiday, wherever you are, you feel like you have to answer your emails. However,
you do if you're an MP.
I'm still always going to feel like that. I felt like that when I worked in a women's refuge. I felt like that. Yeah, I don't know that any piece of legislation is ever going to stop me feeling slightly fraught about work. Not necessarily because I was under pressure, although my constituents definitely put me under pressure. But I don't know whether we've culturally gone too far the other way now, but it's not a bad idea. I agree with it in principle, absolutely. 100%.
Oh, you do? OK,
so because Labour would... international organisation,
yeah,
you could be dealing across many time zones, so that just is the nature of the job.
Labour might like to make it a legal right.
Yeah, I think that I like the idea that employees and employers have more of an understanding about what acceptable work requirements are, and I think it differs so much from job to job that I'm quite sceptical about this kind of one-size-fits-all idea of there being a right, because I think the demands of former special advisor, partner at Portland are very different to other roles, and so I think it is important for flexibility. What I think we're seeing in the workplace is a lot more people just able to articulate and advocate for the kind of work flexibility that they need. And more of that conversation is probably the right way to go, rather than, for me, a blanket right.
I think it's probably quite likely it'll end up like the Working Time Directive. When you sign your contract, you sign that waiver saying there is this maximum number of hours, but I work in a profession where that's not suitable, and just sign it all away. So I think, yeah, it might work in some jobs. I think other jobs it's much more difficult.
Let me just show you this headline. This has come up today after an interview that Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, gave to BBC Breakfast, in which it says she refuses to commit to Labour keeping pensions triple lock in BBC grilling. The triple lock being that state pension would rise in line with either wages, growth or inflation, whatever is highest. We've had wages figures with bonuses. It's well over 8%. Why didn't she just commit to keeping the triple lock?
I mean, I think she was asked it because Rishi Sunak has not committed to keeping the triple lock, and in fact said that he's not going to, or made it relatively unclear. And the truth is that the Labour Party is under the iron fist of Rachel Reeves, not going.
The Shadow Chancellor.
Yeah, who is the Shadow Chancellor, is absolutely not going to allow us to make big commitments, A, before the election, or B, even we have no idea what state. We've got 2 fiscal events potentially before the next election. Who knows what's going to happen?
Do you want it to stay, the pensions triple lock, or is it unaffordable?
I think we do have to have a national debate about the affordability of an ageing demographic. That it's a Ponzi scheme. We've got a Ponzi scheme for a pension scheme. There isn't a fund with my name on it, in the Treasury that's my fund, like a personal pension scheme. This is reliant on workers of today paying for the retired of today as well. It's not the way you'd actually start a new pension scheme, but it's what we've inherited, and it's quite natural around most of the Western world. This is what they've got to. The only country I know of that actually made a change to that was Chile about 20 years ago. They ran a parallel scheme so that over time it won't be reliant on this Ponzi system. But we need that debate. But let's be honest. Pensioners have no other means of getting new money. They are stuck. And so the concept of triple lock is absolutely right, and it served us very well. We introduced it, and it has taken more pensioners out of poverty than I think any other scheme that we've seen. We were
the last Labour government brought more pensioners out of.
We were
poverty.
laggardly in comparison to much of Europe, and we're now not. We did suspend it during the COVID period because we had that unusual wage growth.
So do you think it's unsustainable now?
We had that unusual wage growth. It was fairly benign before we had inflation of 10%.
Well,
so therein it becomes very costly.
Right.
But I think the debate needs to be had about the long term for pensions. But at the moment, it's a commitment we've given older people, and I think we should stick with it.
Will it stay?
I think it will, because even though the policy challenges it presents are so enormous, the politics of this remain very difficult for both political parties. And the reality, as Craig says, of the ageing population means that demands and uncertainty that comes through inflation and the ways in which, as you say, kind of wage growth and inflation and interest rates therefore impact on the triple lock are only going to become more challenging. But
Yes.
the public. And I think that it would be a very hard sell for either political party to really make radical changes to the way that that's introduced. You can always introduce a benefit. Taking it away is a lot trickier.
Yeah.
Indeed. Will it stay?
I think there's absolutely no way on earth that both parties...
Is that a cast iron guarantee?
It is a cast iron guarantee. You can bring me back on and hold me to account. I think that where there might be difficulty, though, is this threat that's already been kind of put out there that benefits and universal credit may not go up with inflation next April. And we went through this last year with Liz Truss. They thought, oh, yeah, benefit scroungers, all this, were threatened not to put it up, even though 40% of the people on universal credit are working. And they thought about the idea, and then when they go to their constituencies and they realise how many people do receive universal credit and how toxic it would be if they didn't raise that with inflation, they thought about it a second time.
And we're not talking about inflation here. We are asking, or begging almost, that people have restrained wage demands, otherwise you can entrench inflation in the system. And yet we are almost entrenching that similar inflation by increasing inflationary rises, because everything keeps chasing itself as the inflation spiral escalates. So, we're talking about inflation, got to bear down on it. Everybody agrees with that across the political parties, I would have thought. And yet, on the other hand, we're breaking that inflation pledge by these massive increases in benefits. I'll put it there as a discussion point.
Thank you. Let's talk about a different pledge. In The Guardian, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, tells the G20, he's come back from there in India, UK will resist hair shirt policies on net zero pledge. He says the net zero story for me shouldn't be a hair shirt story of giving everything up and your bills going up. That's not the vision of net zero that I think is the right one for the UK. Let's talk to the pollster and co-founder of Delta Poll, Joe Twyman from North London. Hello to you. Joe, what did you make of Rishi Sunak's comments?
Well, it's not really surprising to me. It's in line with what I expect to be the kind of strategy that the Conservative Party will be adopting going into the next election. When you look at the polling around this, you see it's actually quite a complicated picture. Since 2019, Delta Poll has been working with the University of Oxford to track sentiment towards the principle of net zero. So in other words, reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. And we found consistently that around about 6 out of 10 people support that idea and only 1 in 10 opposes it. So you have 6 times as many people supporting than opposing. But that's around the general principle. When you look at all of the polling around the subject, you see that, well, there's, let me put it gently, some interesting approaches to polling on both sides of the argument. And indeed, anyone on any side of the argument can point to something that will support their position. But if you look at the general themes, what you find is that support is there in principle, but it reduces the closer you get to money being paid out immediately. And also when you have things like a policy that will affect the least well-off in society, or indeed is seen as unfair, that reduces support. And so going into the next election, I think it will be interesting to see how all of the main parties balance this support for net zero in principle with opposition to specific areas of it.
Joe, we'll come back to you in just a moment. On that, I mean, Craig, you're chair of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group. This is net zero by 2050. Is Rishi Sunak right that we can get to net zero by 2050 without costs, extra costs, to consumers and without our bills going up?
I think we possibly can in a future decade, but not in this one. I mean, the reason I've set up the Net Zero Scrutiny Group is because to decarbonise the UK is going to cost something like 3 trillion, 1.5 times the GDP of the country. And I think, as Joe puts very, very well, The idea is supported by everybody, of course. You know, we know one day the oil and gas, even if you're supportive of oil and gas, is going to run out. We will need an alternative technology and fuel to keep the lights on and industry turning. But we've been in a bit of tread water land for the last few years, where it's been lovely idea, yeah, we'll support that. Oh. We're now getting to the reality of costs, and that first reality of costs, I know not a direct net zero issue, is London's ULEZ. Well, and I have to say,
all right, well, that's the ultra low emission zone, but clean air zones.
They're in the similar framework and a similar family.
But Rishi Sunak is saying it can be achieved without extra costs, so he's wrong.
I don't think it can if we go up the current route of Whitehall nudging us towards unknown, very expensive technologies, EVs we don't particularly want, heat pumps that are really not very effective. I mean, I've got a completely different energy plan. That is a decade of gas, preferably domestically derived, lower CO2. What's not to like about that? As we move towards rolling out small modular reactors, and then perhaps the eureka I've been waiting for since I was in Shorts is fusion technology, and then we'll look back and say, what
have you really been waiting for that since you were in Shorts?
You'll be waiting a lot longer.
I mean,
I'm telling you, mate.
We know small modular reactors can be done. We know that.
All right. Well, let's. I don't mean to
we'll look at this country and say, what on earth have we done, covering it in wind turbines that don't work very well, and new pylons and solar panels taking agricultural land out of use.
Just
and I think we'll look back and wonder what we were
to
doing.
That sort of Craig McKinley prospectus for how we reach net zero, do you think Rishi Sunak is wrong or right that we can achieve it, but without some pain, financial pain?
Look, I think that the idea that it is hair-shirt, there is a huge amount that we can be doing to transition to net zero by 2030 or 2050. That is about reducing the costs that people in our country have to pay, whether that's in energy, through insulating their homes. In my area, we have in fact, all cabinet ministers have to tell you when they're visiting your constituency, and they all visit mine because we have a sort of decarbonising energy centre in my constituency and hydrogen refuelling stations. And the pace at which it needs to be going, it has been stagnant. Craig is absolutely right in saying that we have been in this sort of Cinderella state for about 10 years where we haven't advanced things anywhere near what we need to do. And actually, just putting it off for another 10 years, I know Craig doesn't like the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, but they've said it will cost twice as much if we put it off.
So it's going to save money. I mean, if Jess is right, it will save us money.
What we're hearing, we're conning ourselves. Everyone says, oh, wind is cheap. Yeah, wind is cheap when it's running absolutely perfectly and every bit of it is being used. When the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, we are not factoring the cost of storing that electricity, whether it's in new reservoirs at height, so you get hydropower, or batteries. And I'm afraid if you're telling me that mining cobalt on the backs of children in the Democratic Republic of Congo is green or sensible, then I'm sorry, I'm no longer with you.
Well, let's get to the politics of this too, because you mentioned the ultra-low emission zone expanded by Sadiq Khan, the mayor in London, and it looked as if it did contribute in some way to Labour losing that by-election and the Conservatives keeping it. But broadly, the Conservative government is committed to phasing out petrol and diesel cars by 2030, phasing out gas boilers by 2035. Are they going to slip, do you think?
No, I don't think they are going to slip, but I do think that we are in an important phase of the conversation around net zero. I think for a long time we sort of had this, it's just a win-win. Everyone will benefit when we transition to net zero. And now I feel like we're having a conversation about some of the trade-offs, right? The fundamentals, the reform that we need to make to the grid alone to be able to bear the load for electric vehicles and all the other things we need it to do. These are real, considered, crunchy and quite challenging policy decisions to be taken. And so I kind of applaud the fact the conversation is moving into how do we do this in a way that it doesn't, broadly hurt people that are lower down the income chain? How do we do it in a way that encourages enterprise and innovation and new industries? And how do we not see it as a very simple and straightforward thing where there are no difficult policy choices to be made to deliver a kind of transition that really works for the country?
I mean, Anita's outlining the discussion going on in the Conservative Party, and obviously Craig does too. But since that Uxbridge by-election, we were sitting here through the night. Has it traumatised Keir Starmer and the Labour Party to some extent that actually they've changed their view about net zero and how it affects people?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think even speaking to people, Labour people in the run-up to that by-election, they knew that that would be a difficult issue. I think that's why, since that time, you've seen changes to the scrappage scheme, making it more generous, because Labour Party clearly wants to hang on to the London mayoralty next year. I think that on the other side, there has been a danger that the Tory party think, well, this is the way we can win an election by reversing on green policies. And actually, all we've seen since then is the UK losing its reputation as being a leader on the world stage. And it's no longer able to kind of encourage other countries along this path.
Right, the Uxbridge by-election, did reality suddenly politically hit Keir Starmer and the Labour Party?
Look, I think that, you have to take stock when people... that's what we are Democrats. We have to take stock when people say something. You have to go and listen to them, and I don't think there's any shame in that. However, I think that, that what you have to do is make sure that you are mitigating for those, certainly, as has been said, in the lowest... income category and those who would be hardest hit by these changes. But if I give you another example that isn't London obsessed.
No, Birmingham's got a clean
Birmingham
air
has a clean air zone.
Well, I looked it up because I suddenly thought
no drama.
Why is
that council's going well, isn't it?
I tell you what. Well, just like Woking Council's going well with twice as much debt as Birmingham. The issue in Birmingham. So, for example, we put in a levelling up bid in my constituency to have retrofitting in homes in thousands of homes that would have massively levelled up, provided loads and loads of jobs in the area, and the money was then given to for the West Midlands to like a Worcester Theatre or something. The reality of the situation is that you have to absolutely be making sure that the transition takes people with you.
Well, on that, Joe Twyman, I will come back to you very briefly at the end. But Joe, you mentioned the general election. Do you think the government and the Labour Party are going to talk more about the trade-offs?
Yes, I imagine so. From a public opinion point of view, it strikes me that this isn't a matter of policy, this is a matter of communication. There are potentially enormous costs to striving for net zero. There are potentially enormous costs in not striving for net zero. And so both parties will be wanting to put their policies across and getting across the broad idea that their approach to environment and climate is fair, is effective and will be introduced efficiently. The degree to which they win the argument may, of course, come down to their own popularity. And with a government as unpopular as the Conservatives are at the moment, it may not matter what they say, the public may not believe them.
And on that last point, Craig?
Well, just on these, the facts. Britain is the outputter of 1% of global CO2.
Well,
we can see that China has more of an incremental increase in CO2 output. They're building new power stations, coal power stations. Their increment in 1 year is more than the entire output of the UK. People are wondering, why am I saddling myself with this cost?
Fine. So what do you want Rishi Sunak to say at the next election? Whether they're listening to you or not.
Let's just concentrate. Just the ULEZ thing, I think, did change things massively. Why 2016 diesel? I know it's one of the Euro 5 or whatever it is. To me, a 2016 car, keeping it running a little bit longer, has got to be the most sensible thing to do. I'm thinking of many older people. They don't need another car. It's the last car they're ever going to have. They do a bit of shopping and all the rest of it. Why are they being demanded to scrap that? Or they pay £12.50 a day. You're not telling me air quality has suddenly got better because I've got to pay £12.50.
Well, I understand, particularly on that policy, but broadly, just finally, into the next election, what should the message be on green policies and climate change?
Well, I think Labour are listening because Labour-run Cambridge have now scrapped their similar ULEZ scheme.
I know you think that the Labour Party are going to win the election, but she's asking you about the Tories.
No, let's look at the reality. The Labour Party is already moving. They can see that this is a real negative for them in Cambridge, so they've scrapped it.
Okay.
I would hope that the Conservative Party will have a drawing of breath and say, let's go down a sensible pathway on a global basis, and we're not going to unilaterally bankrupt ourselves.
Joe Twyman, thank you very much for joining us. Let's talk about asylum because Keir Starmer is heading to The Hague later this week. He's going to talk to officials from Europol, the EU's cross-border law enforcement organisation, to discuss his party's proposals to limit numbers crossing the Channel. Here's the headline. Starmer to highlight Labour plans to tackle Channel crossings. We can see some of the latest figures from my colleague Simon Jones. He has tweeted 144 migrants in 3 boats crossed the Channel yesterday, taking this year's total to over 23,000. That does, however, he says, represent a fall of around 17% compared with the same period last year. It seems an intractable problem, Jess. What difference is Labour and their proposals going to make to stopping the boats?
Well, the reason that Keir Starmer and I believe Yvette Cooper are going over to speak to Europol is that, I mean, we don't have a organised crime plan in our country currently that even says the word channel crossing in it. It hasn't been updated for 5 years. It literally bears no relation to the reality of the situation that we have with organised crime that is basically taken over our borders and is seeing these sorts of figures coming in. So the Labour Party is going over to Europol to discuss the specific sort of cross-border criminal targeting force that needs to be put in place.
Craig, would you accept the government's failing on its own terms in terms of stopping the boats for whatever reason? And they've pledged to do that, stop them.
Well, I think perhaps a pledge was the wrong thing to do, because you're very much in the hands of French authorities. Are they prepared to stop the beach launchings? I mean, unless they're prepared to stop
They do stop.
They stop about half, and maybe a little less than half. But we've offered them almost any amount of money to stop this, and they haven't. Contrast that with Belgium, who have been prepared to actually stop people in the water, and they don't receive any UK funds. They are actually doing what is internationally decent and required of them. Now, I raised a point last week, and I'd recommend maybe Keir do the same with the European Commission. How is it that if I'm a UK dinghy manufacturer and I want to export into France or the single market, I've got to go through the CE marking, customs codes, VAT accounting, and yet these unmarked, dangerous dinghies, which are killing people in the Channel, are flowing in from Turkey into the single market without a buy nor leave. Now, I'm confused about that. We either have a legalistic EU single market that applies, or we don't, and that's the question I'm asking.
Just what is it about Labour's plan and their proposals that will really move the dial on this? A bit more law enforcement, I'm sure people would welcome that, and it could stop a bit of the people smuggling.
We've seen a massive reduction in the people who are criminalised in the last 10 years. There's been a 70% reduction in those who are criminalised for trafficking people into the UK, so it definitely, one would hope it would make some difference. But the situation is a difficult one. The Labour Party will inherit a difficult situation. The huge problem that we have in asylum in our country at the moment, I mean, there has always historically, we talk now as if this is the first time there's ever been anyone coming to our country. That is simply not the case. However, the growing number of people left stagnated in the system while the backlog builds and builds and builds is the thing that's costing us £2 billion.
No, I agree with your criticisms on that. I do agree with
just before, because we've only got a few minutes. Anita, can I just show you this in the Times? Former Cabinet Minister Robert Buckland urges Rishi Sunak to rethink Rwanda policy. What do you make of that? Is that an admission that, I mean, it hasn't got off the ground, to coin a phrase, but this is the former Justice Secretary, and the suggestion in a piece that has been written not by him, I might add, but the Bright Blue think tank, suggesting that it should be amended, not abolished, and the government should arrange for the removals of migrants to Rwanda only when they've had their asylum claims heard and refused and are failing to leave the UK voluntarily.
I've got to say, I slightly think the Rwanda conversation distracts from some of the really complex ways in which this has to be tackled. There isn't a single thing that is going to radically change the dynamics that mean people get on these boats. And this is a problem happening across Europe. And I think we have seen some things that have made a significant improvement, like the deal with Albania. Now, that has radically changed the number of Albanians coming over on these boats. The deal with Turkey around tackling sort of some of the gangs that are operating out of there. Likewise, more money to France. These are sort of the things I feel like are going to make a real tangible difference in the time frame we're talking about. It slightly feels like the Rwanda thing has overtaken a lot of the conversation in a way that I think hasn't really built people's confidence in the public in our ability to tackle this.
Briefly, I was going to say, Labour, though, are willing to sort of get on with this issue politically. Is that because they see it as a big problem for Rishi Sunak?
Well, they see light tax as another area where the Tories have ruined their reputation. You just see the backlog growing. And rather than doing the sensible things like building more returns agreements, they spent too much energy and time on things not just like Rwanda, but like the barge, which has done nothing to bring down costs, and it hasn't acted as a deterrent.
That's all we have to... All right, very briefly, you've got 5 seconds.
Can do more than one thing, and I think they are.
Yeah.
All right, that was short and sweet. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to... I think we're coming to the end of the show, but we can continue afterwards. But thank you to all of my guests, and I'll be back tomorrow at 11:15 for Prime Minister's Questions. Bye-bye.